There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being left out. It comes from seeing too clearly. Most people spend their entire lives chasing belonging. They shift their opinions based on the room they're in. They laugh at jokes they don't find funny. They stay quiet when they should speak, and speak when they know they should stay quiet. They dress for the group, eat for the image, and love in the way that gets them the most applause. And for a long time, sometimes for decades, this works. The approval flows in. The invitations come. The group holds them close. But then something happens. It could be a single moment, a betrayal so small that they can barely name it, a conversation that ends with a strange, hollow feeling in the chest, a party they attended, surrounded by people they've known for years, where they looked around the room and felt completely, profoundly alone. Not sad, not angry, just aware. Aware that something in the room was being performed, that the laughter was slightly too loud, that the warmth was slightly too efficient, that every person there, including themselves, was playing a role they had been rehearsing since childhood. And once they noticed it, they couldn't unnotice it. Carl Jung called this the beginning of a psychological crisis, not in the clinical sense, but in the ancient Greek sense. Crisis, meaning a turning point. A moment when what once sustained you no longer can. Jung believed that most people reach this turning point somewhere in midlife, though it can arrive much earlier or much later. It arrives when the ego, the constructed self, the mask you built for the world, can no longer hold. When the gap between who you truly are and who you've been performing becomes too wide to ignore. And the first symptom of that gap is silence. Not the comfortable silence of someone at peace. The restless, aching silence of someone who has started noticing too much. Who hears the subtext beneath the words. Who watches the subtle politics of every social exchange. Who finds that small talk doesn't feel small anymore. It feels like suffocation. Like you are slowly drowning in the shallow end of the pool while everyone around you splashes happily and wonders why you're not having fun. That silence is not depression. It is not social anxiety. It is not misanthropy. It is the first tremor of something much deeper. Something that, if you follow it honestly, if you resist the enormous pressure to return to the comfortable noise, will take you somewhere most people will never go. It will take you to yourself. Jung gave a name to the identity we construct for the world. He called it the persona, borrowed from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona is not entirely false. It is not a lie. It is a necessary interface between your inner world and the demands of social life. You need it to function. You need to know how to act in a job interview, how to hold yourself at a funeral, how to be appropriate in a room full of strangers. The persona smooths the rough edges of the psyche and makes coexistence possible. But here is where things go wrong. For most people, the persona doesn't stay where it belongs. It doesn't remain a tool you pick up and put down. Slowly, gradually, through thousands of tiny social negotiations beginning in childhood, it fuses to the skin. It becomes the answer to the question, who am I? And by the time most people are adults, they have forgotten that the mask and the face are two different things. Think about how this begins. A child is born with a full emotional range. She cries when she is sad. She screams when she is angry. She laughs until she can't breathe. She tells the truth with a directness that adults find alternately charming and alarming. And then the training begins. Not maliciously, not consciously, just through the ordinary mechanisms of social approval. Don't be so sensitive. Stop being so dramatic. Be nice. Stop showing off. Smile. Settle down. What will people think? Every one of those corrections is a deposit into the shadow, Jung's term for the psychological container where everything that can't be socially acceptable gets stored. The aggression goes into the shadow. The ambition goes in. The grief goes in. The hunger for something more goes in. The parts of the personality that feel too big, too strange, too raw, too honest, they all get folded down and locked away. Because belonging felt more important than being whole. And this trade feels reasonable for a very long time. Until it doesn't. Until something breaks the illusion, and you realize, with a clarity that hits like cold water, that the people you've been performing for have been performing just as hard for you. That your relationships have not been exchanges between two real people. They've been exchanges between two masks. That the intimacy you thought you had was conditional on both of you maintaining the act. And the moment one of you slips, The moment one of you says something too true, feels something too visibly, or simply stops pretending, for one unguarded second, the whole arrangement trembles. This is the moment the withdrawal begins. Not with a declaration, not with confrontation, with a quiet, internal pulling back, a growing reluctance to explain yourself to people who weren't actually listening, a diminishing appetite for the social rituals that once felt natural, a creeping sense that the energy required to maintain the performance isn't worth what it buys. From the outside, it looks like you're pulling away from people. From the inside, it feels like you're finally pulling toward yourself. Here is something Jung understood that most of us resist for as long as we possibly can. The qualities you are most certain you don't possess are the qualities you are most urgently being asked to face. The things that make you furious in other people are almost always the things you refuse to see in yourself. The colleague whose arrogance drives you to distraction, the friend whose neediness exhausts you, the public figure whose dishonesty fills you with contempt. Jung would look at every one of those reactions and say, "Look closer." Not because they aren't arrogant or needy or dishonest. They may be all of those things. But the charge, the particular heat of your reaction, the way it lingers, the way it activates something primal in you that belongs to you, that is your shadow knocking. The shadow is not evil. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it. The shadow is exile potential. It is the anger that could have been healthy assertiveness, buried because assertiveness wasn't safe in your household growing up. It is the ambition that could have driven something meaningful, suppressed because standing out felt dangerous. It is the grief that needed expression, packed away because falling apart wasn't permitted. It is the raw, unedited self that existed before the world had its way with you. And the shadow does not disappear because we bury it. Jung's whole career was a documentation of what happens when we don't. The buried shadow doesn't vanish, it emigrates. It shows up in our relationships as irrational jealousy, as sudden eruptions of rage that seem disproportionate to what triggered them, as the unconscious sabotage of things we claim to want. It shows up in the groups we belong to, as the collective shadow is projected outward onto enemies, onto outsiders, onto anyone different enough to serve as a screen. History is, in many ways, a chronicle of what happens when the collective shadow goes unexamined. But individuation, Jung's word for the process of becoming psychologically whole, begins when a person stops outsourcing their shadow, when they start looking at what's inside them with the same unflinching honesty they've been applying to everyone else. When they stop asking what is wrong with the world and start asking what is wrong with me, not in a self-flagellating way, but in a genuinely curious one. This is brutal work. It requires sitting with things about yourself that are uncomfortable, recognizing the ways you manipulate, the ways you perform, the ways you have used people for validation, for comfort, for a sense of identity, the ways you have been less than honest, less than kind, less than the person you present yourself as. Not to condemn yourself, to integrate, to bring those buried parts back into the light and give them their proper place in the full architecture of who you are. And here is the paradox. The moment you begin to own your shadow, you stop projecting it onto others. And when you stop projecting it onto others, something startling happens. People become far less threatening and far less interesting as objects of your judgment. You start seeing them clearly, not as heroes or villains, not as saviors or persecutors, but as human beings doing what human beings do, protecting themselves, seeking connection, managing their fear, navigating their own buried shadows as best they know how. The contempt softens, the idealization drops. What remains is something quieter, a clear-eyed, patient compassion that has no need to be performed. That is the gift of shadow work. But it comes at a social cost, because when you stop participating in projection, you step outside the invisible economy of most social groups. And the invisible economy does not quietly let you go. The withdrawal happens slowly. It rarely announces itself. One day you notice you've been declining more invitations than you've been accepting. Not because you're depressed, because the events you're declining feel like they would require you to perform a version of yourself you're no longer willing to perform. Because the conversations you'd have there would circle around the same surface topics that once felt comfortable and now feel like a kind of slow suffocation. One day you realize you've stopped over-explaining yourself. That when someone misunderstands you, you let the misunderstanding stand instead of rushing to correct it. Because you've started to sense, quietly but clearly, that some people's understanding of you was never meant to be accurate, that they need you to be a particular thing, and any information that challenges that need will simply be filtered out. So you stop offering ammunition for a battle you can't win, and didn't ask to fight. One day you find that your tolerance for dishonesty, even the small social kind, the comfortable lies that make interactions smooth, has evaporated. Not in a righteous way. Not in a way that makes you want to call people out publicly or lecture anyone. Just in a way that makes participating in it feel physically tiring, like your body is rejecting it. These are not signs of damage. They are signs of discernment. But the world will not see them that way. The world, or at least the social world most of us inhabit, has a very specific set of responses for people who begin operating outside the normal range of social transaction. First comes the attempt to pull you back in. Humor, nicknames, invitations, the gentle social pressure of "come on, don't be like that." This is not malicious. It is instinctive. Social groups regulate themselves. They maintain homeostasis. And a member who begins behaving unpredictably, who stops performing their expected role, who no longer responds to the normal levers of approval and disapproval, is experienced as a disturbance. Not consciously, but the discomfort is real. When the pulling back doesn't work, the interpretation shifts. Distant, cold, arrogant, thinks they're better than everyone else. These are the labels. And here's what makes them so effective. They have just enough surface resemblance to something real that they're difficult to reject outright. There are people who are distant because they are genuinely contemptuous. There are people who are quiet because they genuinely believe they're above the conversation. So when the label lands on you, when someone accuses you of the very things you know you aren't, the doubt creeps in. Am I becoming cold? Have I lost my empathy? Is this psychological growth, or is this just loneliness dressed up in philosophical language? Jung anticipated this doubt. He called it one of the necessary temptations of the individuation process. Because the pull to return, to put the mask back on, to perform the familiar role, to trade the discomfort of clarity for the comfort of belonging, is extraordinarily strong. It is, in some ways, the defining test. The people who turn back at this point are not weak, they are human. The need for belonging is not a character flaw. It is one of the deepest needs in our nature, and there is nothing wrong with choosing it. But there is a cost. The cost is the slow erosion of the parts of yourself that were just beginning to surface, the reburying of the shadow, the refusing of the mask, and the strange specific grief that comes from knowing you could see something clearly, something real, something true about your own nature, and chose to look away. Some people live their entire lives with that grief. They can't name it. It shows up as a vague dissatisfaction, a persistent sense that something is missing, a recurring dream of a road not taken. They are comfortable, they belong, and they are haunted. The ones who don't turn back, who keep walking into the quiet, find something different waiting for them. The popular story about solitude is that it is the absence of something, the absence of people, the absence of connection, the absence of belonging. Jung told a different story. He spent the years, following his break with Sigmund Freud, in a period of intense, voluntary isolation that he later described as the most important and most terrifying of his life. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. He built a stone tower with his own hands in Bollingen, on the shores of Lake Zurich, a retreat with no running water, no electricity, no distraction. He went there regularly for decades, not to escape, to listen. What he found in that silence was not emptiness. It was density. The inner life, he discovered, is not a quiet place. It is a crowded one, populated with figures, with voices, with images and impulses and memories and dreams. The reason most people experience solitude as unbearable is not because silence is empty. It is because when the external noise stops, the internal noise becomes audible. And what comes through is not always pleasant. The unfinished grief arrives, the old wounds press forward. The anger you couldn't express in that conversation 3 years ago finds its voice. The fear you've been running from shows up, sits down, and refuses to leave. The desires you've been suppressing, for a different life, for more honesty, for something you can't quite name, rise to the surface. For someone who has been avoiding all of this through constant busyness and noise and social engagement, this is genuinely alarming. But for someone who has been through enough to understand that the inner material is not a threat, that it is in fact the substance of their own unlived life, asking to be acknowledged, solitude becomes something else entirely. It becomes the most productive space they know. This is the shift that changes everything. The shift from experiencing solitude as deprivation to experiencing it as resource, from exile to laboratory, from punishment to practice. In solitude, the quality of your thinking changes. Without the constant social pressure to frame your thoughts in terms that will be palatable to whoever is in the room, you start thinking in your own language. Your actual opinions emerge, not the ones you've been performing, but the ones that live underneath, the ones shaped by your direct experience rather than your social positioning. Your aesthetic sense sharpens. Your moral compass, freed from the noise of collective opinion, begins pointing somewhere more genuinely your own. The philosopher Paul Tillich wrote that the first duty of love is to listen. Jung would have extended that the first duty of self-knowledge is solitude, not permanent solitude, not rejection of the world, but the regular, disciplined practice of entering the silence and letting what's there speak without interruption. Most people never do this, not because they're incapable, because they're terrified of what they'll hear. And that fear, Jung would say, is precisely the reason to sit down and listen. There is a particular quality you begin to notice in people who have been through this process and come out the other side. It is not confidence exactly, though they often have that. It is not intelligence, though they tend to be reflective. It is not charisma, though they can be magnetic. It is a quality of settledness. They are, in some fundamental way, not waiting for anything, not waiting for approval, not waiting for the group to validate their choices, not waiting for the world to arrange itself in a way that finally permits them to be who they are. They are simply already who they are, in a way that is quiet and complete and does not require an audience. This quality is deeply, viscerally unsettling to people who are still relying on external validation for their identity. Because the settled person, by simply being settled, holds up a mirror. Their self-possession is not aggressive. It is not a judgment. It makes no demands. But it creates, in the people around them, a subtle but unmistakable discomfort. The discomfort of proximity to something real when you've been living inside a performance. Some people respond to this with fascination, with a gravitational pull toward the person who has somehow found a way to stop negotiating with the room. This is the origin of what we call natural authority, not the authority of position or power, but the authority of someone who no longer needs to convince you of anything. Others respond with hostility. The hostility is almost always disguised as criticism. They're arrogant, they're aloof, they think they're above it all. They don't know how to connect. What the criticism is really expressing, if you trace it back to its root, is something closer to, their existence makes me aware of how much of my own existence is performance, and I find that unbearable. This is why the most genuinely individuated people in history, the philosophers, the mystics, the artists who were genuinely ahead of their time, were so frequently misunderstood, marginalized, dismissed. Not because they were wrong, because they were real in a way that exposed everyone else's unreality. And humanity, collectively, has never been gracious about being exposed. But here is what the psychological literature and Jung's own testimony makes clear. The settled person does not ultimately experience this hostility as the tragedy it might appear to be from the outside, because they have, by this point, fundamentally changed what they need. They no longer need the crowd's approval to feel valid, which means the crowd's disapproval no longer has the power to destabilize them. They experience it. They register it. They are not impervious to pain. But they have what the Stoics called equanimity, not the false equanimity of suppression, but the genuine equanimity of someone who has looked at their own depths honestly enough that nothing coming from the outside seems quite as threatening as what they've already survived on the inside. They choose connection carefully. They invest in a small number of relationships deeply. They do not broadcast themselves. They are not performing. And the connections they do make, because they are not based on mutual performance, because they don't require either person to maintain a false front, have a quality of realness that people who have never stopped performing have never experienced. This is what Jung meant when he said the goal of individuation is not perfection but wholeness, not the erasure of the shadow, but its integration, not the transcendence of the human, but the full, honest inhabitation of it. There is a price for this. Let's not pretend there isn't. The price is a certain kind of loneliness that does not go away. It changes in quality, from the sharp, aching loneliness of someone who has lost something to the quieter, more tolerable loneliness of someone who knows exactly what they are and accepts that not everyone will understand it or want it. But it doesn't disappear entirely. The price is the loss of easy belonging, the loss of the comfort that comes from being seamlessly absorbed into a group, from never having to hold a position against social pressure, from never being the person in the room who sees something that no one else wants to see. The person who has gone through individuation can never fully go back to not seeing. The perception, once sharpened, stays sharp. The price is also a kind of responsibility that sits heavily on certain days. The responsibility of acting from your own values rather than from the group's expectations. Of making decisions you cannot justify by saying, well, everyone else was doing it. Of living with the full weight of your own choices. But the gift is that you become someone you can respect, not in a self-congratulatory way, not in a way that requires anyone else's acknowledgement, but in the quiet, private, incontrovertible way of someone who has looked at themselves with open eyes and chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, not to look away. The gift is freedom of a particular and rare kind, not the freedom from discomfort. You will still be uncomfortable, not the freedom from loss. You will still grieve, but the freedom from the particular tyranny of a life organized around other people's approval, the freedom to think your own thoughts, to feel your own feelings, to speak from your own center rather than from the social role you were handed. The gift is that when you are with yourself, in the silence, in the solitude that once felt like exile, you are in good company. If you've been watching this and something in it landed, not with comfort, but with the particular discomfort of recognition, then I want to say something directly to you. What you're experiencing is not a malfunction. The withdrawal you feel from social performance is not depression. It is discernment. The silence you keep returning to is not isolation. It is orientation. The growing sense that your life as you've been living it doesn't quite fit anymore, that the role you've been playing doesn't quite match the person you're becoming, is not a crisis. It is a beginning. Jung spent his entire career arguing that the psyche moves toward wholeness the same way a plant moves toward light, not because it was instructed to, but because it was built to. The movement is built into the architecture. The crisis that feels like dissolution is actually the old structures making room for something larger. The loneliness that feels like abandonment is actually the self, gathering itself. This does not mean the path is easy. It is not. It means the path leads somewhere, and the somewhere it leads, through the shadow, through the silence, through the long, difficult work of becoming genuinely and fully yourself, is the only place worth going. Not because it will make you happy, though it often does. Not because it will make you successful, though it sometimes does. But because at the end of a life, the question that matters, the one you will not be able to avoid in your quietest moments, is not was I approved of, it is not did I belong, it is not even was I loved. It is, was I real? The person who has gone through individuation, who has faced their shadow, worn down their persona, walked through the discomfort of solitude, and come out the other side settled and whole, that person can answer yes. And that yes is worth everything it cost.